Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Professor Panter-Brick, a professor of anthropology, health, and global affairs at Yale University. Professor Panter-Brick's research consists of critical analyses of health and well-being across key stages of human development, giving special attention to the impact of poverty, disease, malnutrition, armed conflict, and social marginalization. Her focus on children in global adversity has included biocultural research with street children, refugees, and war-affected adolescents. She has published widely on child and adolescent health, including articles on conflict and mental health in Afghanistan, household decision-making and infant survival in famine-stricken Niger, the social ecology of growth retardation in Nepali slums, biomarkers of stress in the context of violence and homelessness, and the effectiveness of public health and humanitarian interventions. Today, we talk with Professor Panter-Brick about research she's done on the role fathers play in parenting. Welcome, Professor Panter-Brick.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with an overview of the work. Tell us about it.
So we completed a study of parenting interventions globally around the world that engage with men in their role as fathers.
Okay.
And fathers matters for many different reasons. They matter for children, for families, and for global citizenship. And we argue in this study that it's the father factor that we forget to leverage in parenting interventions that are essentially gender blind and focus on mothers instead of co-parents. And so we call this the father factor, or the forgotten father factor, in research, practice, and policy.
Okay, and what kind of interventions did you look at?
We looked at mostly parenting interventions that are, there's a huge diversity of interventions throughout the world. So there are home-based visit, hospital-based interventions, community-based interventions to bring inmates or socioeconomically disadvantaged parents or first-time parents who haven't married their mothers all on board for effectively caregiving of the child. And I think there's three levels at which fathers matter.
Okay.
The first is for the child, so they matter for their social, emotional and physical well-being. They matter for their educational outcomes. They matter for their life satisfaction, for their capacity for empathy, and all those aspects that we know well. They also matters for the families, for mothers, and helping mothers, an issue of gender equity in the home. And I think the most exciting dimension is they matter for global citizenship, because the way that a child has been raised influences the way that child raises their children. And so you have parental skills, social skills, mental health, disposition to violence, all cascading from one generation to the other. So if you take settings like conflict settings, you have a perpetuation of violence or the ability to break the transmission of violence from one generation to the other through raising our children more effectively. We simply argue that fathers have been forgotten in that equation, that their role is sometimes sidelined and sometimes undermined. And we want to cast more attention on those.
Okay, so what was the impetus behind you taking on this work?
So it was really a partnership between scholars, practitioners, and advocates for policy making. In the study that we published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, there are 6 team members. 4 of them are at Yale, from the Yale Child Study Center, the Macmillan Center, Anthropology and Jackson Institute, and 2 of them are from the Fatherhood Institute in London. And so, as well, it was inserted within a wider conversation with NGOs that are invested in the caregiving of children and big organization like UNICEF. It was really prompted by a conversation we had with the Turkish Mother-Child Foundation, who have implemented mother support programs, workshops that are geared towards mothers and their children for 25 years in Turkey, and a program that's implemented at national level. And they have just recently launched a father support program because the Turkish mothers came to the organization and said, look, we can't implement everything that you've taught us at home with our children if the men are going to be obstacles at home. So please bring them on board. So they had this father support group, which is originally auxiliary. And then they discovered that fathers really, really matter. And so I think they were the one who made us stumble upon the importance of fathers. But we were the one who set that evidence on a scientific global perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the methodology of your work.
So the methodology was a systematic review of the literature. So we really had to do two kinds of searches. One of them is the very standard literature search.
Over what time period?
Just 1 year.
Okay.
I mean, we took a year, but the parenting interventions are those that exist forever.
Okay.
And that captures the very best known interventions in the world today. And then we did a second search, a thematic search, to get to the most, to the ones that don't get published in the literature, and discovered parenting interventions in places like Ukraine, Peru, Niger, Jordan, Pakistan, and other places.
How did you get at that secondary level? I mean, that seems it would be difficult to find out.
Through contacts, through websites, through one good example are the UNICEF programs that are rolled out across the world. So through detective work. So that two-pronged approach between the systematic and the sleuth finding, put those articles together. So in the end, we ended up with 1,000 articles that were parenting interventions with dads on board, not just mothering interventions. And we in about 20 different countries. And we looked at those pretty closely.
Okay. So what do you think the implications of this study are?
Well, for one, it's not a very good idea to sideline the importance of fathers. And for second, we need a policy change at the highest level in terms of the design of our interventions that can sideline them. So we have no means of really effectively evaluating or engaging with men. And it's not that we want to just engage with men as opposed to mothers, but we want to leverage co-parenting if possible. And we want to find out what works best in particular context. So to give you an example, my favorite example is in Niger, École de Mari, which means school for husbands, which men join when they get married in order to get schooled into the skills of being fathers and husbands. And they learn about gender equity and their power to give children access to education and care. So of course men are the decision makers, so the stakes are very high, but it's a lovely way of bringing on board the men. Another good example in Brazil is the work from Instituto Promundo that looks at ways of redefining the masculinity of men so that they move away from a disposition of violence and domestic violence inside their home and really become effective caregivers and have more equitable relationships with their partner. So there are interventions that really demonstrate that fatherhood is a transformative moment for men, that they want to raise their children in a different way, and we can move them away from that disposition of violence, harsh parenting, disciplining masculinity worldview towards one that makes them really engage in raising the next generation for empathetic and more peaceful young men and women, which we think is very important.
Of course, it sounds very idealistic, and I wonder, in thinking of certain countries, it must be very difficult to institute those kinds of changes in certain places in the world that have, from a cultural perspective, men being very, the ruler.
Yeah, they're macho,
right?
But you.
I mean, how do you work around that? That seems
one
like
very
it's a very
interesting way of doing things that we don't know if fits the best, but it's one that seems to prove good in certain respects, is a men-only workshop, where instead of bringing women and men together, you give a platform for men to discuss these issues, and they're quite surprised to find that other men have these kinds of problems, etc., and find strategies to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, things are very difficult. A great example would be Northern Ireland for peace building in terms of bringing together groups of Catholics and Protestants that are coming to the table with the same idea, which is that their children should not go through that, and they have to raise their children in a different way. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes these men-only group or even co-parent groups, you learn to overcome the stereotype that you might have towards the other, which is why we certainly think that men-only group or co-parent group might be more effective than just home visits, mm-hmm. because they make you relate to other people across the ethnic, religious or social divide. Right. And that has the potential for breaking down some stereotypes. Mm-hmm. And we do find that in certain places in the world. And you have to have the same aspiration for your children. Mm-hmm. And that's a very good pathway. So we have a book coming out, myself, Jim Leckman, and Rima Saleh at UNICEF, called Pathways to Peace, mm-hmm. where we put together this idea or review the concrete evidence that we go from the biology of the brain to peace building in ways that the standard idea is that the way we raise our children will matter for health and social development. Now the big new idea, the bold idea, is that the way we raise our children will matter for peace building, and that's mm-hmm. a hot subject. Right. And the conversation is really percolating at the highest levels of policy making. Mm-hmm. For instance, in the United Nations, there's great excitement at this idea that we could do peace building through grassroots family and children-focused policies. Mm-hmm. That seems to be a nice pathway that's practical, grounded, and yet achieves the big goals mm-hmm. of making the world a better place for our children right now without losing more time.
Right. It sounds like a wonderful idea. I just wonder how difficult it is to actually implement. For instance, I think of, I just was speaking with someone about the Central Africa Republic, which of course is, in the midst of a war, and it's a very diffuse situation. So that comes to mind where, in terms of, in terms of the policy that you're speaking about, would probably work very well there. But I'm wondering how difficult it is to get those kinds of programs going.
Yeah, well, we think it is a matter of having some advocates and mm-hmm. partnership between the media, mm-hmm. The parents themselves, and the structures to enable them, to give them the wherewithal to raise their children right. in that possible way. But a great example of media action, for instance, would be the African Fatherhood Initiative that puts out posters with a man and a baby saying it takes a man to be a dad. Mm-hmm. And that's a lovely way of saying, dads, don't think that babies are the realm of women. Right. Because we know from the biology of parenting or caregiving that it takes about 15 minutes for hormonal change to happen to a man when you give a baby. And the more experienced the man is as a father, the quicker these hormonal changes are happening, principally oxytocin, the hormone of love. And that primes a man to move away from competition and aggression to care and love. Mm-hmm. So we think we can leverage some kind of biology mm-hmm. in having men engage with babies so that the attachment is very strong, and basically structure the brains of men and babies mm-hmm. in ways that prime them towards empathy and social relationship rather than aggression, fear, and punishment. Mm-hmm. I think that is an important piece of the scientific evidence, but that alone is not going to make it happen. So we have, with partners, established or advocated towards a early child consortium and peace building mm-hmm. consortium, and it was launched at the UN a year ago. We go back to the UN very regularly. There was the anniversary of the International Year of the Family. Most recently, there was the United Nations General Assembly Forum on Peace. And so these conversations are happening at the very high level, as well as in particular places in disadvantaged neighborhoods, like in Turkey, in Brazil, in Niger, and in Central African Republic. Okay.
Okay.
So I think the global picture there's a will there to change things, and we just need to see the wherewithal. The big point is that parenting skills are not just mothering skills, that we need to have better means of leveraging that father factor that we think is really the missing ingredient. The game change in a parenting intervention would be to bring on board the men just as strongly as you've brought on board the women. And if I can give you another example of a media campaign, there's the he for she campaign, meaning that you don't look after women by just advocating, just having the women advocate for themselves, engaging the men that really is the game change or really matters. So it's that vision and then putting the policies that don't undermine that vision that is really important. And the excitement, I think, is when the science and the policy and the practice are coming all together and not at odds with each other.
Right.
And I think that moment is coming.
Right. I agree. So that's great. Well, thank you very much for being here today and sharing some of your work. It's fascinating.
Thank you, Marilyn. So we need to make the most of fathers, I believe.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn.
For more information about Professor Panter-Brick and her work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.